Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the 41st session of this year's Bridport Literary Festival. Thank you all for coming. A special thanks to our sponsor, Tim Clark. Tim, very generous of you, and thank you very much indeed. Very kind. I think some of you will know me. I was a career soldier and did other things after that, and I have an interest in military history, and that's probably why I'm here today. Now, the most important thing for me to do at the start is to introduce our speaker, David Owen. Known, I suspect, or the name known to the majority of us here, because we're of that generation. After graduating from Cambridge, David went into clinical training, ending his medical days as the Registrar of Neurology and Psychiatry at Tommy's in London. In 1966, not 96, he became Labour MP for Plymouth Sutton and latterly for Plymouth Devonport, where he was the Member of Parliament for 26 years, a long time. During that time, he served as the Minister of State for Health. He had a ministerial job in the Navy and in the Foreign Office, and became in 1977 the youngest Secretary of State for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office since Anthony Eden in 1935. And he was then age 38, so you can work out how old David is now. In 1981, David, along with Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, and Bill Rogers, the Gang of Four, formed the Social Democratic Party, which actually was a very, very popular party, and had we had proportional representation, I think they would have had a considerable following in the government. In 1987, the Liberal Party merged with the SDP, which was not much to the liking of David, who resigned at the 1992 election and was made a life peer. After that, he became quite involved, or very involved, with international affairs around the world. You may recall the Vance-Owen peace pact in the Balkans, very involved with that, and latterly in many other international issues. Importantly, and this is very relevant to the book, David spent 20 years, up until 2014, being involved with Russian industry in steel and in oil. And indeed, he was the UK chairman of UKOS Oil between 2002 and 2005. And we may hear a little bit more about that later. He met, during his time as a politician, obviously many high-ranking Soviet people, such as Brezhnev, Gromyko, all those sort of people. His third book that he's published is called Riddle, Mystery, and Enigma, and of course comes from the famous saying by Winston Churchill on the 1st of October 1939, when he said, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But there is a key, and that key is Russian national interest." And we'll come back to that fairly shortly. The book is a tome and covers 200 years of Anglo-Soviet and Russian relations. David and I have decided that we can't possibly do justice to 200 years in 40 or so minutes. And bearing in mind that Jeremy Bowen is not coming tonight, we're going to talk on a very contemporary basis, essentially about the Ukraine and Putin, which I hope you will all find to your liking. So without much ado, may I welcome David Owen. David, I wonder if we could start by just discussing what we really mean by national interest, particularly in a foreign policy context, Because it strikes me that while Mr. Putin might think that the special operation in the Ukraine is in his national interest, a lot of Russians might not think so.
Well, it's difficult to know what Russia really thinks. This is not a democracy. They have made various attempts to have democratic elections, and on balance, most of Putin's elections he is accepted as actually won, probably not by the margins claimed, but he's been a reasonably, up until now, popular Russian leader. As far as assessing his value and his importance in Russia at the moment, it's very difficult. I think there's little doubt that he is not on his own to the same extent that he was at the start of this war. I think there is already evidence there are about 6 people who are formulating their policy. Probably 3 of them, including himself, he is the predominant influence, and the other 3 are probably critical. But none of us really know what's going on, except I think there's a growing feeling now that Putin is on the way out. And I personally welcome that. I don't think you can say when it's going to happen, but broadly speaking, nobody, even in not a democracy, takes their country into a war which had no obvious reason for it, and spends the whole time, months, on the borders of Ukraine telling everybody that he has no intention of invading. An obvious and blatant lie, and must have been immediately apparent to every Russian when he did invade, and then fails. Now, I'm not saying it's a permanent failure, but I think many people have been shocked to discover, and I certainly am one of them, that the Russian army, who we thought was strong and effective, and that was quite a common position in NATO up until this war started, after the second invasion of Ukraine, is clearly not had the resources that maybe even Putin thought he was sending to them. And the corruption has reached such levels in Russia that money that was meant to be going to the military didn't find their way. And certainly looking at some of the really old tanks, old equipment they have had, this is not the modern army that NATO has been gearing itself up to face. But that is not to underestimate the extraordinary capacity of the Ukrainians to fight. They, of course, are fighting for their country, and in a very dramatic way. And if they fail, they will lose their country. But their new leader has shown a remarkable capacity to speak for his country right around the world. They have gathered support, and I think there are a lot of people not normally committed to those sort of causes, not terribly interested even in foreign affairs or even defense, whose heart is with them. And the question now which they have to face, most wars come to an end with negotiations, and is this an opportune time? The only thing I would say from my experience of the Balkans is when you're ahead, it's the time to start to negotiate. Don't wait until you're on the downward track.
Let's stop there, because we'll return to that when we talk about the war in more general terms. Let's just do a Ukrainian timeline since the last war. Of course, when the UN is set up, Ukraine becomes a member of it. It's a Soviet state within the Soviet Union as such. The first thing I find extraordinary is that in 1954-5, Khrushchev gives away the Crimean Oblast to Ukraine. Why did he do that?
Well, he was Ukrainian.
He was.
And so is Brezhnev. But you see, they didn't see these borders as anything more than peripheral borders. The border that mattered was the USSR. And therefore, it was not a man. Some people said he was drunk when he did it. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. But Khrushchev was quite partial to a little vodka. But I think it was, I mean, the official argument was that Crimea was failing under Russian governments. It was becoming poorer. It was not achieving its agricultural targets. It was not doing what we wanted. And so he thought, well, let's put it under overall Ukraine control, and gave it to them. So that's how Crimea left, if you like, Russia for Ukraine. But I mean, it was all part of the USSR, so it was just a sort of...
And of course, they had an agreement with Sevastopol that they would keep that for 40 years.
Yes, so they guaranteed their naval port. And, but this is why there are a lot of Russians who are very puzzled about this war. They've been used to ringing up their relatives in the Ukraine and treating them as if they're Russians. They speak Russian, many of them. They're friends with them. They can't really understand why there's war. And I think we've got to understand that Putin, the earlier Putin, would not have landed himself in this mess, in my view. And we have to ask yourself, why did he move towards this thing? He was very isolated during the COVID period. He got into the hands of some rather stupid historians who tried to preach him a history that was being regained. But underlying it all was that KGB, which is after all where his origins are, Putin's, never accepted Yeltsin's decision to take a smaller Russia, the Russian Federation, to not fall for Gorbachev's wish to keep a sort of empire, and went off and declared independence for the Russian Federation with the president of Ukraine and the president of Belarus. And at one fell swoop, Gorbachev's dream of keeping the overall USSR and all the baggage of all these different countries was over, and you were in for a much smaller Russian Federation. And that has been rejected by quite a lot of KGB believers, that the Russian Empire could survive effectively the defeat of the Berlin Wall breaking up.
Let's go on a little bit, and we get German reunification in 89-90. And then in 1994, with the Soviet Union, really the final days of it, we get the Budapest Memorandum. What does that tell us? What happens there?
Well, the West, seeing all these nuclear weapons all over the former USSR, was extremely worried. The security of these weapons were not very high. We know that some crossed over into Iran. We knew that probably other people were ready to try and buy them. So a great American-led effort to persuade Gorbachev to tighten control and to persuade the Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons that were on their soil. Now, did they belong to Ukraine? Well, they were part of the USSR, but they were seen by the Ukraine government as being theirs, and they didn't want to give them up, but they were persuaded to give them up, and under the American and other NATO countries' supervision with the Russians, the weapons were destroyed. And a very large number of nuclear weapons were finished. And under supervision, we know that they were destroyed. That was a great achievement. But in order to make Ukraine confident in this, we all signed, America, Britain, France didn't quite sign it at the same time for some reasons, and Russia signed an agreement that borders of Ukraine would be sacrosanct. Now, after what's happened, the world who's not nuclear will take a lot of convincing that if you have nuclear weapons, you should never give them up. And that's one of the really nasty elements that has come out of the war with Ukraine, is that it's shown that great countries, United States and United Kingdom, don't keep their word. And let's be quite blunt about it. And then they reaffirmed it, actually, in 79. So, I mean, this was not a totally dead treaty years and years ago. And the Ukrainians thought that they could not be invaded by Russia because of the Budapest Memorandum.
Yeah.
And,
so that's important. Moving on to 2004, we get these two politicians, Yushchenko and Yanukovych, who sort of fight it out for the presidency, one being very pro the West, the other being very much a sort of puppet of Russia as it is then. How does this all work out?
Well, one of the men's up, you may remember, his face was all covered with
dioxins and
clearly poison. And the Russians began to realize they were going to lose Ukraine. He was their puppet. He was overtaken by demonstrations. Agreements were negotiated. The EU tried to have a foreign policy, and they negotiated a settlement. Obama came in and supported it, and it was overturned. The compromises of this settlement, which the Russians signed up to as well, were swept aside, and there was a revolution, and led to an undignified withdrawal of the elected president to Russia, and a determination on behalf of Putin to assert his authority and to take Crimea. It was all done in a matter of weeks. And he moved very fast, but he'd been planning for it, I think, for a long time, and realized that this was the mood of Ukraine. They wanted to become members of the European Union, and he was not prepared to see Ukraine effectively separated off from the Soviet family. And he had the opportunity, and he took it and conducted it rather cleverly and rather well. And the Germans accepted it in the shape of Merkel, and went into the Minsk talks. The British government, it's very hard to find any statement. Cameron and the then Foreign Secretary said virtually nothing. And so the first invasion of Ukraine was met by appeasement from the West. And it is serious appeasement. There's no question about it. And it encouraged the second invasion. All I can say is I was doing business in Russia, and in 2014 I decided to pull the company, which was on the stock exchange, out of Russia completely. By 2015 we were out, and I thought, but I never anticipated that there would be so quick a second invasion. And the first edition of my book, there's nothing about it. The paperback is...
You shouldn't be saying that, David, at this stage, because we want people to buy the hardback. Well, let's go back to 2008 and the Bucharest summit, which is a very interesting time because, of course, there we see the agreement that NATO will move further east. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, and everybody else will gradually be absorbed into NATO because they want to be. They want the security that NATO offers. Now, Russia, the Soviet Union before, has always needed a buffer. Whether you look at the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon marching on Moscow, whether you look at Operation Barbarossa in 1941, it buys time to have that buffer. And that buffer was lost. And Putin must have felt very vulnerable. And indeed, we had promised at time of reunification of Germany that, although it was never written down, but verbally we agreed, I think, that there would never be a move of NATO further to the east.
It wasn't quite as definite as that. Certainly a lot was said by individual NATO countries, foreign ministers, and even heads of government, which gave the impression that there would be no such movement. But it was never hard and fast. It was often contradicted by American presidents. Bush himself never went along with it. Yeah. So you understand why the Russians build on it, and they have every right to use this argument. And it has a long history of being supported by American historians, and indeed the American who really designed in 1945, the post-war consensus always held that you should not go right up against the Russian border. I think it was undoubtedly a mistake now when you look at the two invasions of Ukraine, but you do have to remember that you are making independent countries, and they were afraid of their security. And they were right to be afraid. That we now certainly see. And in a way, we also began to sense change in Russia. And I think it was led by American presidents, led by Bush the Junior, but acquiesced in by the British and by the Germans, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. You felt it was their right, having agreed to be independent, having demonstrated they were democracies, didn't happen straight away, having more and more identified with the West, who were we to stop them becoming members of NATO? I used to be very critical of it, but I've listened to quite a lot of people who were in the situation where they wanted this safeguard of NATO membership. And I must say they've convinced me it would be quite hard to say no. But we went at it obviously too quickly. It probably was a mistake, but an understandable mistake. And after all, if Russia was a democracy, what had they to fear? The fact is, they were not a democracy. And I think it's better to criticize how badly we handled Yeltsin in particular. After all, abolished communism and took on the market economy. Gorbachev was always a more difficult person to assist because he still really remained a communist. He was much more equivocal. But Yeltsin was a man of great courage, apart from being drunk a lot of the time. But he definitely needed more help with the movement towards a mixed economy. And we put in a lot of spivs from London as well as from New York and France and everywhere else, who went in with too much money, came out whenever they lost money, went back in whenever they thought they could make money, were not fine exemplars of the market economy, and it went wrong. And I think we could have helped Yeltsin more. I regret it myself. And I also regret that we helped Yeltsin win his election when he was very ill with the shares for votes. And we knew this was a corrupt election. It would have been better to let the communists win. He wouldn't have been able to do very much, but it was irreversible, the changes. But we aligned ourselves up with some very shady business people on the market economy. We didn't give financial help to Yeltsin, and we allowed his last election to be a bought election, and therefore reduced our effectiveness in arguing for democracy. So mistakes were made.
Let's look at a bit more detail at Putin the man. Why was it that Yeltsin decided to select Putin to be his successor? Because, I mean, Putin had a meteoric rise. I mean, FSB 1 minute, head of, next moment deputy prime minister, the next month prime minister. What was it that Putin had that made Yeltsin anoint him?
Well, it's a good question, and it's difficult to answer. The basic elements that you have to remember is that when there was a counter-coup against Yeltsin, and the Duma was heavily involved in it, he actually shelled the Duma. And so he sent in Russian military to take the politicians out inside the Duma. And he, from that moment on, always said to his closest confidants, they'll get me in the end. They'll get me on this. I'll be hung. And it haunted him. And therefore, as he got older, he got more and more worried about his own life if he retired, and his health was getting very bad, and his family started to get themselves involved in corruption with the arrangements that were made with a Swiss company to put gold all over the Kremlin buildings and domes, and a lot of money was spent in this project, and quite a lot of that went to the Yeltsin family. Now, Yumashov was a very interesting figure. He was in charge of Yeltsin's staffing and arrangements. He was quite open about this, and it's quite attractive, actually, to find somebody here openly admitting to doing things, although he's unrepentant about it. He said Yeltsin looked at how he could protect himself in his retirement, and he looked at two figures of prime ministers, and each one, he came to the judgment, wouldn't actually really protect him. And their third person they settled on was Putin. And they decided that he would. And that was actually the right judgment, because he did protect Yeltsin. And it is as bad as that, if you like. There was no principle about it. He was chosen purely and simply because he would protect the Yeltsin family and their money. And on the day after he became the president, he was put in a preferential position. He was acting president, and Yeltsin fully and absolutely backed him. Anyhow, the first order that Putin put out as president of the Russian Federation was to protect the Yeltsin family, to bring them into the enclave which was protected, to have a pension for life, and to, well, that's politics, I suppose you could say.
Putin and Gorbachev, of course, were great disciples of Yuri Andropov, who, from 67 onwards, had been the head of the KGB, briefly, 83, 84, had been General Secretary of the Politburo. What was it about Andropov that Putin so admired?
And Gorbachev.
And Gorbachev.
Gorbachev would go on holiday with him. He was a dedicated communist. That's the first thing to recognize. And he was a very powerful man. But he was honest. He was not corrupt. Probably with one other general, only two people in the Politburo under Brezhnev who was not at all corrupt. So here you see the big difference between Putin and Andropov. So I often wonder whether Putin ever faces himself with that. When he became president, the first thing he did was to lay a wreath on Andropov's grave, and then little later, he put up a plaque over the flat in Moscow where Andropov lived, and then he had a larger-than-life statue made for him in St. Petersburg where Andropov came from. So he's absolutely clear, he won't challenge you if he was here in this room, that Andropov is the man he most admired. And I think it's quite important to realize this, because Andropov was a tough character, but a realist in lots of ways. And that was really what Putin looked as if he was going to be. And, don't let us escape reality. In 2003, he was invited to Buckingham Palace and stayed as a guest on a state visit to the UK. But even then, there was trouble. And I recount in the book that Debbie and I were there, I think for the first time, not because I was a former foreign secretary, but because I was the international chairman of UKOS International. And a very tall man came across. I could see he was weaving his way towards me, and I wondered who this guy was. And he comes in front of me, puts his finger on my chest, and he said, "You, Lord Owen?" I said, "Yes. Tell Khodorkovsky, who was then the head of UKOS, to stay out of politics." Turned on his corner and left. So the first thing I found he was staying there, therefore he was very important in terms of Putin. And then I also discovered that he was the head of the Leningrad region, still called Leningrad, St. Petersburg, but he's the most important region and very important for Yeltsin. And that was a message. And I think that the history of that period would have been difficult if Khodorkovsky had accepted that the price of being a businessman in Russia from now on was you stayed out of politics.
Yeah.
You couldn't have that option.
Sure. And giving 50% of your wealth probably to Mr. Putin as well.
Helps.
It helped.
Yes. The oligarchs are a strange group of them, one of whom is a friend of mine and is Uzbek. He's probably one of the richest people in the world. They know what they're not asked for money. It's much more cleverer than that. They know what if he decides to make Sochi, which should never have really been chosen as a winter resort because they didn't have enough snow. But I mean, the decision was taken, so the oligarchs all line up, they build hotels, ice rinks, and everything like that, and they make Sochi a pretty good, presentable world winter sports place. I think we get a lot of the oligarchs wrong, but they have made absolutely indecent amounts of money. And I personally think it's absolutely right that we've stolen all their yachts, if you could say it, or pinched them, or anyhow. The only question is, will anybody ever buy them? Or have enough money to buy them? And all their houses and everything like that. And there is the nexus of really quite a sizable project for the rebuilding of Ukraine. So I think it's not a bad start on the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. You take all the oligarchs' wealth.
Yeah. So here we are. We've got President Putin running what is a kleptocracy in essence, a ruthless kleptocracy. We've talked about the oligarchs. He then changes the constitution, and in 2012, I think, and decides that he almost can be president for life.
Mm-hmm. I think 2012 election. I mean, here you have to. There's a puzzle in Gorbachev's life. I mean, not Gorbachev's life, Putin's life. He steps down from being president of Russia and makes Medvedev president for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012. He gets very unhappy by one of the decisions which Medvedev makes, which is rather helpful to all of us, that when things went wrong in Libya and we needed to go in and try and help against Gaddafi and his sons, the UN resolution went through with an abstention from the Russians. Very unusual and not been done ever since. And Medvedev made, in my view, a sensible and rational decision. And Putin hated it. Then the uprising in Georgia was suppressed. And again, Putin was restless and didn't like the way Medvedev handled it. So he told Medvedev, you know, I'm afraid I'm not coming back. Medvedev was always placed there, didn't have a personal position of authority. But he did give up power for 4 years. Kissinger, who has been seeing him over many, many years, and I strongly support that. I think it was a good idea to have a proper dialogue with somebody. And I know him reasonably well, and Kissinger never says anything of what he's discussed with it. But there's no doubt that a sort of element of international realism has been taught to Putin, and there was a possibility that that's where he would go. But during the 2012 election, it is widely reported, maybe unfairly, that Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, asked the CIA to upset the result and interfered with the Russian election in quite clear-cut way with quite substantial amount of dollars. And that made Putin very anxious. And when he broke down in tears when in the announcement of the result, up until then they hadn't really rigged elections in any major way. I think he tried hard to rig it when he realized he was up against opposition. But I think this started a hardening of his heart. Remember, we made him a member of G7 to G8. Russia was brought in. So we didn't ostracize them. We didn't dishonor them. We recognized them as a considerable country. We gave the diminished Russia all the voting rights and the status as a veto power in the UN Security Council. So there's another side to the idea that we demeaned Russia. We didn't at all. I mean, it's a very much smaller country, much less powerful. But I think that that's where it all went wrong. And I think a lot of the attitudes now, the admitted interference in American elections, and maybe in ours, I don't know, we've thought not, but certainly it was potential was done. But interference all around the world started, and he changed Now, there are some people who say he was always an evil bastard and don't make any explanation for him. And KGB were all foul people. That's not actually the case. It's very hard to know when you're trying to look into the mind of somebody. And I've written a lot about hubris and about how people change in power. I think he changed personally in power, and I think he's become a much more unpleasant and a much more a worse leader for Russia as the years have gone past. And I think this second invasion was corrupt in every aspect of it and not tolerable. And I think that what NATO did was quite remarkable, actually. We have seen a very different NATO. New powers. NATO was always a defensive alliance. We were never going to attack another country. We never gave weapons to Hungary or to Czechoslovakia when they were uprising. We felt that went beyond being a defensive alliance. We rejigged the rules, if you like. I mean, I think we're perfectly entitled to do so, but I think we should admit that the rules were changed. And we redefined defensive, and we could give weapons and guidance and support as long as we didn't actually go to war. So our troops, and that's been a very delicate line we've had to hold, that we're not fighting Russia. The Ukrainians are fighting Russia. Now when we face the question of should they start to negotiate, you've got to be very careful. This is delicate. We have put them into this fight. We're responsible for they having these huge casualties. It's a very, very difficult call for the president of Ukraine now. I think we're right to ask him to look hard at a negotiation after getting Kershaw back. But we have to recognize that he's got to carry his country with him. He's got to carry many, many widows and many, many people who have been very seriously injured. It's a tough call.
And do you think Biden will hold him to that? There may be some quid pro quo. Perhaps the aircraft that Poland were going to give the Ukraine, which Blinken, I think, was very keen on. Could that be a sort of quid pro quo for an agreement or some form of peace negotiation?
Yes, this is the MiGs in Poland would find their way into Ukraine, and American modern aircraft would go into Poland. Biden stopped that about a year ago. I think he thought that went a little bit too far in this definition. And he might well still think so. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we don't need to prove our credentials, and nor did Britain. I mean, I think you can all have different views about Boris Johnson, but he has given us very good leadership over, in my view, Ukraine. And we've been there very solid, and the first and the most important arms suppliers from Europe was from Britain. And I think we've used our independence, which we got, to make our own defense policy, our own foreign policies, even though within NATO, to act within NATO, but to be up front. And I think we've done well, and I'm pleased with it. But I think that this is the president of Ukraine, properly elected, the first real Democrat to hold that job for a long, long time, maybe always. And I think we owe it to him to advise, but not to say, if you don't do it, we will give you the latest weapon system. And it would be an act of great statesmanship if he accepted Biden's advice. It would be an act of great statesmanship if Biden's advice was not accepted, and we still went on supplying weapons.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very, we're treading almost a moral tightrope on this.
Yeah. Final question before we go to questions. We must talk a bit about China and the danger of moving Russia towards the China camp. Obama infuriated Putin, of course, many years ago, didn't he, when he talked about Russia being a mere regional power. When we're dealing with China, we're dealing with a superpower. We cannot afford to see Russia going closer to China. So we have to maintain a dialogue of some sort with Russia. How do we do that?
Well, I think when there was talk of using tactical nuclear weapons, America and Britain and others made representations to China to intervene, and there are some signs that they did. They said they didn't think that it was appropriate to use nuclear weapons. I've always believed that this separation of tactical nuclear weapons and trying to present them as just a little bit more powerful than conventional weapons is a load of nonsense. And I think once you start it, it's going to go on and spread, and therefore it's very, very dangerous. And I think China has been helpful on that. Also, there's some signs they didn't like what's happening to grain supplies because it's actually affecting them, but also a lot of countries with whom they've got close relationships. So they were. I think that it should be an absolute standing rule of British politics, going back quite a long way, that we do choose between Russia and China, and we prefer China. I faced this issue, an absurd issue. The Chinese asked, we're talking long distant past, 77, 78, for Hawker jump jets. Now this vast country that can have any number of airfields doesn't need jump jets. So I had to take it to Cabinet, and Tony Benn was totally opposed to this. And I said to the Cabinet quite bluntly, there's not the slightest chance of them ever buying a Hawker. This is a test. They want us, this is going to be, we've already refused Russia can have them, they want to be seen to be different. Now these are of course different relations, different times. So the Cabinet made the sensible decision, we said yes, the Chinese were very pleased, they've never gone near buying one. So it was a lot of these things in politics, you need to look behind what's there. What is on the surface is quite often not what's being discussed. Now, I think we should have an absolute rule of politics that we are not going to do anything to push China and Russia together. And if a policy looks as if that's what's in fact you were discussing the river and the demarcation, which actually showed how extraordinary, I wasn't unfortunately at it, but I think that we shouldn't underestimate it. There is a better relationship between Russia and China. But if you go over the Ural Mountains and you go into the oil Siberia and you see the number of Chinese that are running bread and breakfasts or little hotels and everything like that, you see that they're coming across that border, they can't stop it, and the Russians don't like it. And there are a great number of Russians and that across that side who don't like relations with China. It's still quite a sensitive issue with public opinion. And I think that if we handle ourselves carefully and well, we need not encourage that at any stage and treat them both with respect. We disagree with them, we don't like their philosophy, we're not going to become communists, but we can live in a world in which they hold their ideology. And this is where we're in a tricky situation now because of what Biden has said on Taiwan. This is difficult for them. Here we are, America's putting a lot of effort into stopping the invasion of a democratic country in Ukraine. And can you really go on sort of having a sort of form of words which effectively says we're not going to get involved if you do invade Taiwan? There is a linkage in people's minds, and they're quite rightly. And yet, do we really want this one? Do we have to fight Shanghai Shek's fights? Remember, Britain recognized Communist China many years before the United States, and quite rightly so. We weren't hung up by Shanghai Shek and all this sort of stuff. We also argued that China should have the veto in the UN. We've always expected and treated China for a very long time in Britain as a major power, and we've honored them. So I think a British Foreign Secretary should aim to be on all fours with America, and I'm very pleased with this collaboration between Australia and Japan over a nuclear submarine. If you're traveling all these distances, Sorry, I've muddled it up. It's what I want to see actually extended to Japan. But this is just between Australia, the US, and the UK on nuclear submarines. Diesel submarines have to surface and put up some method of getting some oxygen into their engines, and that can be picked up these days in satellite technology. And submarine warfare is what was going to be the key over Taiwan. And so it seemed to me Britain was asked by the Australians to be there. The French got their nose out to join. I don't think British diplomacy did this, despite the French, in the slightest way. We just knew that diesel submarines were nowhere near as good as nuclear-powered submarines. Slowly, we've gone back into the Pacific. So east of Suez is over now, and we're with 2 aircraft carriers. In my view, where we should be mainly is in the Indian Ocean, and help not tie up American carriers in the Gulf and let them spend most of their time in the China Seas. We should help them. And so we are now spending money, which we can ill afford given the overall strains on the defense budget, in the Pacific. And we can't do a lot, but I think we are right to toughen our position when the Americans toughened their position on China and Xi. I think that was sensible. There's a long way from doing that to getting ourselves involved in a war over Taiwan. We should be very careful on this. And if we have to have a slightly different position from America, we should not too worried about it. We've had different positions over China ever since the Chiang Kai-shek fell.
David, thank you very much. Let's go to the audience. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions you would like to ask Lord A. So let's have a show of hands. The gentleman with glasses, go down, Tanya, there, on your left.
Sorry, can you hear me okay? So many years ago I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, and it struck me that he was lamenting the Russian amnesia, the civil population's amnesia about all the horrific things that they suffered under Stalin. We look at Iran today and the civil disorder and dissent. Do you think that the Russian people themselves may wake up and do the same thing? And if so, how might we, how might we help them?
I honestly don't know. I think, at the moment, the best Russian example of the future attitudes was this extraordinary drone photograph of this vast empire that Putin has built himself on the Black Sea in this great covered ice rink so that he could play ice hockey, and the sheer lavishness of the whole bloody thing. And this section of television of all of this has been watched by millions of Russians. And what then happened with the, when the man who, I'm just slipped his name at the moment, the
Navalny.
Yes, dissident, who was poisoned, like in Salisbury, with...
Skripal.
Yes, absolutely outrageously, and went to Germany. And I kept on saying, why on earth has Putin allowed them to fly to Germany? Well, we now know he'd given them, he thought, a second dose so that he'd be dead on arrival. When he wasn't damn near dead on arrival. The Germans managed to save his life. But what did he do? He went straight back to Russia. Now that's real bravery, and it's real understanding. You will never have a turnout of Putin from outside. It'll have to come from within. Russians have got to stand up to it from within. And that was a wonderful. Then he did it, before he went, he did all these television things. And some of you may not have seen it. He imitated this. He was the boss of the man who they knew, who'd smeared his underpants with this biological weapon. And he has this discussion with him. Then they put it on television. So then you find millions of Russians laughing at Putin. The most effective propaganda that's done against Putin ever since we've been trying to change Russian opinion. We're active. We have our intelligence are doing a thing. Americans are doing a lot. It is building up, but is it enough to overcome the fear of the authorities and the KGB in its new arm, FSB? I don't know. I hope it is, of course.
David, I discovered just a useless bit of information to you all. I couldn't believe this. Putin's paternal grandfather was the private chef to no other person than Stalin and Lenin. Interesting, isn't it? Another question.
Fascinating, Sir Owen. I've enjoyed listening to you. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which the Americans made certain pledges to the Russians, and this was all at the time of the unification of Germany, as you know better than I do. This young American author has written a very important book, which is called Not 1 Inch. And allegedly, maybe not allegedly, maybe it's well established that Secretary of State Baker said once we resolve the whole question of the unification of Germany and the withdrawal of Soviet troops from East Germany, there would be no more effort to bring other countries into the NATO alliance. But what this discussion leaves out of account is the tremendous upswelling of pressure on the Americans from the Poles, from the Hungarians, not to mention the Baltics. Their deep concern, because they are right on the frontier, about being part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was that kind of pressure, not least from the Ukrainians and their plebiscite in 1991. An overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, even many of the so-called Russian Ukrainians, whose mother tongue was Russian, who voted in support of independence for the Ukraine. So I think in looking objectively at the history of that period, one has to take into account the tremendous amount of pressure exerted on Western policymakers, not least the Americans and the British, that there was a very, very strong feeling in the former Soviet glacis in Eastern Europe, that they wished to come in to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I know you can argue this over and over again, what mistakes were made and so on, but let's not leave out of account the tremendous popular support in countries like Poland, and God knows Poland has had enough bitter experience living beside two very strong neighbors, between two
Let's
strong
stop you
neighbors.
there, Barry. I think we've got the message. David, do you want to say anything?
The answer to the question is Baker, who was a very good Secretary of State and a friend of Bush Sr., did say that. He was disowned by his president, and his president had to fight an election. And one of the reasons was exactly what you said. And if you go to some of the marginal states, there is enough Polish people, Ukrainians, Belarus, to make a difference. And that's politics. And you've got to face it. And so it is understandable. But nevertheless, nobody ever crossed the line. No government signed up for an absolute agreement on this. They were trying also to help the Gorbachev making his adjustment and Yeltsin making his adjustment with his own people. It was a very difficult issue. Always, every Russian didn't want that, didn't want to be surrounded. It's a historical term. And of course, Putin is using this argument now as the justification for doing it. But Russians have got to accept They lost the struggle for the hearts and minds of the people of these countries. And the Berlin Wall didn't come down because of really Russian or policy. It didn't come down because Mrs. Thatcher or President Reagan made speeches. It came down for a whole variety of reasons. NATO, Ostpolitik, Willy Brandt. There are many heroes on this road, but the fundamental hero is the people who in these countries kept their religion often, in spite of communism, kept their faith in democracy, campaigned and fought for it, got it. They didn't want to give it up. And if you were one of the Baltic states, you wouldn't want to give it up. And you know that every Russian government believes that the Baltic states were stolen from them and they should have, under the Helsinki Final Act. When I went to Russia in '77, after a 5-year gap, Brezhnev and Gromyko hammered me very hard about this. They said the Helsinki Final Act in '75 established the 3 Baltic states as part of Russia. And I said, oh no, it bloody well didn't. And it was quite a tough argument.
Just one, let's just quickly, can we, David, because we didn't have time. Just talk very, very briefly on Putin's relationship with the Orthodox Church.
It's absolutely fascinating one, and in the hardcover version of the book, very good reason for buying it, is Putin here, and that's a candle. And this is the cathedral on the bend of the river in Moscow that was destroyed by Stalin. And when Yeltsin came back, he started the rebuilding of this massive great cathedral. And in fairness, Putin also contributed. It's now complete. And Putin has, he has never challenged the end of communism under Yeltsin. And he has moved steadily. Yeltsin started it, getting rich oligarchs to put money into the churches. And now these old deserted churches, disreputable, very poor quality priests, is now completely revived, and the libraries restored, and the buildings restored. So there is a serious group of people who are genuine believers, are worshipping, and Putin identifies with them. And this is why you could possibly see a change of government in, funnily enough, Putin's cook, as he's now called in the press, who actually runs these militia, is some people's tip to take over from Putin. It is possible that they sort of kick him upstairs to be almost a Tsar, and some role, and he pursues his religious, let's say it is genuine, and he is removed from real power, and they take over. That is possible. So, who knows? I keep telling the Greeks they've got to speak out about this and have another interpretation from the Orthodox Church. They don't show great enthusiasm.
Another question down there.
Lord Owen, do you think that the West missed a trick in the early 90s in not acknowledging that the world, that what had given rise to NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the immediate post-war era had changed forever, and sitting down with the Russians to discuss a completely different, more inclusive collective security arrangement which had them inside?
I think we've proven enough. When we took Putin into G7, that was the right vehicle to take this risk on. And his conduct ended up with him being removed from G7. I think that was a more appropriate vehicle. And I think those people who were kept on saying, look, be careful. Russia has not made a fundamental change yet. And even people who support it, like I do, Yeltsin, and I think Yeltsin is a great man, a hugely brave person, and with courage made changes. They kept on saying that people haven't moved, the fundamental involvement in Russian communist attitudes are still there, be careful. And I think we should not have done anything to weaken NATO, and I think this has absolutely manifested itself over the Ukraine. I think NATO's new role is a great tribute. above all, actually, it's obviously the Americans. Truman made a speech about, I'm bringing the boys home in 1945. Then the man had the guts to go back in 46 and say, I'm now saying they've got to stay. That's the bravest speech. I'd like to see a few British politicians make speeches of comparable courage, and then particularly in the next few weeks and months. I think we've got to face it, that NATO's change and its adaptation to the new world has been a magnificent example of the value of that organization. And Ernie Bevin, the Foreign Office diplomats were coming on, as they so often do, wanting to soften the wording. And he said, I don't want to soften the wording. He said, I want to toughen up the wording. I want there to be absolutely no doubt who's in the line of fire. If they start a fire, the United States is in control. That's who's the supreme allied commander. That's the power. And I don't want any of this fudging around with the wording. And that's why he was a great foreign secretary, I think.
And of course, I mean, looking at France and the European Union army, that's now dead in the water, totally. One hopes.
Well, I certainly hope. And there's some good signs that Macron is going to be much more friendly to the British government. And I think that the new Prime Minister, Sunak, also wants that. They're both, in a way, people whose earlier living was made in this financial world. And I think they can talk the same language.
Yeah.
And I hope that we see, I think we're going to see, I mean, no, I mustn't say that.
We're running over time, but we've got plenty of time, and I've had permission from Tanya to go on because I knew there'd be a lot of questions. Let's have another question. Anybody run out?
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us, Lord Owen. Just returning to Putin as an individual, we've heard lots of rumours in the West about his health, and is there any credibility to these concerns, and do you think this might be influencing his behaviour? Is he
Good question.
trying to organise a legacy as the end of his life comes upon him?
Well, this private organisation that tracks all the sort of people's emails all over the world and all the sort of puts them all together in information, has tracked a cancer of the thyroid gland surgeon who is apparently frequently, almost all the time, when Putin moves to a town or city or anything like that, he's there, or somebody equivalent. And therefore people say he's had cancer of the thyroid. Others say he's got cancer of the pancreas. I don't think we really know. He's very secretive, and he could be putting out false information. The other day, people saw on his hand very clear evidence that he'd had a transfusion, maybe of plasma or maybe blood, so maybe he's losing anemic, and he may be another sign he's got either leukemia or he's got a cancer. I think you've got to treat all this with very, very carefully. We don't really know. But he doesn't look quite as strong as he used to, and I think that he's had a good innings. He probably has got some illness, and whether he can be persuaded to go and whether who came in after him would be any better, that's the always thing to remember. So I think it's beyond us. We don't need to speculate very much. It's going to be decided by the Russians, and not a particularly nice bunch of Russians who make up the collective leadership in this much. There was a time when Putin had no regard for anything. I mean, those pictures of Macron and other leaders who ought to know better on this damn great table and sitting at the end of the table. And I kept on saying to my wife, why doesn't somebody just pick up his chair and walk to the middle of the table and sit down? What, in full view of the cameras? I mean, it was not one of those politicians. The British didn't even go, so there we are. I think probably better wise to stay away, actually.
The Foreign Secretary did, though.
Did he?
She did.
She did. I see.
Do you remember?
Did you? I can't remember on the large table. Did she?
Yeah, she had a grueling from Lavrov.
Oh, well, that's different. Lavrov
Yeah.
is different.
Yeah.
Thing. Lavrov is
Yeah.
a man of no consequence whatsoever.
Been there too long. You only need to do 2 years as Foreign Secretary. Any more questions? Yes, in the middle. Middle at the back.
Would there be a change in NATO policy if Trump gets back?
Would there be a change in NATO's policy if Trump came back?
Trump gets
Yes. There's no question of Trump as president changes American policy, and he did when he was there. So we've already had 4 years of experience of Trump. And he boasts at the moment that there would be no Crimean War if he'd been president, because he would have been alongside his mate, Mr. Putin, and they'd have come to some form of arrangement. So I think you can't take it away from him. That's been one of his so-called policies, that you don't need to have problems with Putin, and that nice chat with me, and we'll square all these things over, and I'll sell him a hotel in Moscow. So I think you've got to face up to it, that in a way it was amazing how we all adapted to President Trump, and we have to. America is the greatest democracy in the world, and if they end up with their president, we have to work with the president. And I think you can't ignore that. And I don't see any point really in getting involved in their debates either. By and large, you better stay out of other people's politics. You don't understand it, you don't know what's happening. So I don't think you should make speeches as politicians, say you'll never deal with Trump or get involved in their election, and nor should they get involved in our elections. I think, I'm married to an American, so she votes, and I don't want to see Trump anywhere near any form of elected office under any circumstances. And I hope the courts of law in the United States will. I don't want to bang him up in jail. I think that would be very foolish. You don't overkill on this issue. There are a lot of people out there who respect him, and if you overkill, it'll backfire. But there is one sentence which I think he's lined up for in quite a number of states, particularly in New York, on a whole range of issues, which are about Trump's father, Trump himself, and his sons. And that would be a sentence of not a fit and proper person to hold public office. And I think between now and any form of serious nomination, rather than self-nomination, which may come in a few days' time, could kibosh his chances. And I think it's not hard to see why any sensible legal system would decide that his conduct is not fit to hold public office. And I think that would be the right sort of sentence that could be lived with. But I mean, I'm not American, I don't know. I'm interested in the country, I love the country. But they're a law unto themselves. But Trump has some very serious support, and we shouldn't scoff at it in the sense that it doesn't. And populism. People, I have trouble with the word. Is it a crime for a politician to be popular? And what you have to ask is, why has America got itself in a situation where anybody can give him airtime, let alone anything else? And I think that there are some serious problems in American politics that has allowed the phenomenon of Trump to come up. And I think look at the root cause, and that's the real problem. But he is still there, but all the press said got it wrong. The whole American press went for this idea that there was going to be a Trump revival and that the Republicans are on their way, and they've been proven wrong. And it happens in Britain. There's a herd instinct amongst a good many of the journalists, and they all follow a trend or anything like that for the last few weeks. We go on reading their newspapers. I do too.
Well, there we are. I think we'll end it there. David, it's been a real privilege having you here. It's not often we get a foreign secretary. It's been a tour de force. And actually, Andrew Roberts, great historian who many of you will know, says of your book, thoughtfulness, learning, and sound judgment infuse every page. I do commend this book to you. if you are interested in history, it is a seminal document and well worth reading. David, I can't thank you enough for coming. Thank you very much.